Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. This is Keep It Real number, is it 4? I can't
think
keep track.
No, isn't it like
is
6?
It 5 or
5, 6, 5.
We should probably know this going into it, but either way, 4 or 5, I think it is. But here with Trevor Rappa, I'm Greg
Hello.
Spatz. We do not have Doug with us today, unfortunately, but next time. So we want to talk a little bit about conversation that we had with our students yesterday in the clinic in New Jersey, Trevor and I. It was good. We spoke about what is good enough for a physical therapist to do at the end stage of a post-op rehab, or really any rehab, when you're sending an athlete or anybody back to doing things that they want to do that are obviously going to be more strenuous or more potentially risky than just whatever you're doing in physical therapy. So the conversation got to where, one of our students was talking about how he's previously seen other therapists just kind of like finish their protocols and discharge with things that are what we would consider pretty low level for a soccer player, basketball player, whatever. Something like a skater hop or a hide in or whatever you want to call it, being almost like that's the end goal. And then that just sort of unraveled this whole conversation about what is enough, what is doing enough for somebody to prepare them, so that you don't feel like you're doing them a disservice. And this ties directly into to last week's episode. Doug speaking with Dr. Nicole Serdica about ACL rehab and ethical decision-making in rehab in general. And it's just an interesting conversation that I definitely want to talk more about. So Trevor, you have somebody right now getting towards those end stages of ACL rehab. And you are so far beyond doing anything like a skater hop that you guys are doing some flying 10 sprints and things like you were doing yesterday. You just talked a little bit about, where does the skater hop fit into a progression? Like where do we see typical therapy and where we want to keep going, and what are some things that we can do to push past those those traditional limitations that we might have as a therapist?
The skater hop is a great example of a beginning kind of frontal plane progression, lateral movement power exercise that we probably did around the 3-month marks, give or take, kind of, somewhere around there. That's getting the athlete comfortable moving with a little bit more speed and power in the frontal plane. But if that's purely what we're going to be basing the decision to get them back into sport, whether it's practice and scrimmage or small-sided games, it doesn't really matter. That's definitely not close enough to the level of stress that they're going to be able to need to compete with their teammates and opponents. And that was something we talked about with our students yesterday. Was the goal is not simply to get them back on the field. The goal is to make them a savage when they get back on the field. Just because somebody can get back on the field, that's a relatively low bar to be able to put your cleats on and get back on the field and play with, run around the ball and kick and all that kind of stuff. That's not enough to be competitive within the sport. So we kind of talked about, once they get past the injury themselves, we have to prepare them like we want to prepare any other athlete to be competitive within the sport itself, not purely be a player on the field where they're really not contributing to their own team or being able to stop an opponent. So, the skater hop is a great exercise, and that's part of the progression that we do from a frontal plane movement, but nobody's doing repeat skater hops on the field. They're doing, a shuffle into a change of direction or a lateral run to a hip turn. They're doing all these different movement skills at such high speeds that's what they ultimately have to be able to do. And we talked about, I've never given somebody an exercise to do in a home program that I haven't seen them do myself or coach them myself. So when it comes to return to sports stuff, if somebody has to be sprinting, changing direction, shuffling, jumping, landing in a chaotic environment, if I haven't seen them do some semblance of that in our rehab, then I've done them a disservice, because they're not going to be as comfortable and confident once they actually encounter those situations on the field, in a place that's way less controlled than what we do in, a one-on-one type setting.
Yeah, and I know a lot of therapists are going to be a little handcuffed by insurance in an in-network setting. What are some sort of creative ways, or ways you've gotten around the limitations that insurance might have with that particular athlete? That we do it with any patient that we have. We find ways and we get creative on how how to give them what they need. What are you doing with her right now?
Well, we talk about this because we have two different athletes that you and I are working with that are in different situations. So for this athlete that I'm working with, she has access to a really good like home gym. So she's doing her strength training on her own. So that way, we've covered those things during our sessions, much earlier in the process. But then when she comes in and sees me, then we spend time working on the speed, agility, change of direction type of stuff versus the athlete you're working with doesn't have access to a gym or weights. So when he comes in, that's what you're spending more time working on with him versus he can go and, run on his own and do some of those other things. So it really just depends on what does the person have available to them and what's their priority right now? Do they still need to get strong? Well, then we're going to be continuing to prioritize strength. And if there's something that's still relatively low risk that they can be doing on their own, then that's what they're going to be doing on their own versus if they need to be emphasizing speed and agility and they can still do some strength stuff on their own, they're going to be doing the strength stuff on their own while spending the time with me where I can coach them and watch them and give them cues and make sure that they're moving effectively and safely. And that's what we're going to be prioritizing during ours. And it changes throughout the process. Like early on, you have to get strength and range of motion. That's what we're going to prioritize. Later on, when hopefully this athlete's going to be back on the field in a month, we're going to be doing a lot more speed and agility, and she'll be doing some of the conditioning stuff on her own because she doesn't need me to watch her, jog, but she needs me to watch her sprint and change direction and give her reactive situations.
Right. Going back to what you're saying about like not giving somebody something that you haven't seen them do. So you guys have spent so much time getting strong because she needs that first before she's going to do any of this stuff, change direction, speed, what that you're doing now anyway. And then it's a matter of, like you have all these weights at home, like let's spend the time doing things that you can't necessarily do. Like you don't have me with you at home. So let's find a way to do that here. And we'll send you videos. Like you have an entire program you send her with videos of all the exercises that she's to do so that she can be independent. So that's awesome. And then, that got into, listening to the podcast from last week with Doug and Nicole. It's directly related to exactly, what we're talking about now, what we were talking about with our students yesterday. Nicole does an awesome job where she's blending, she even said she'll sometimes be, in a clinic setting, and then she'll sometimes be on a soccer field for her rehab as part of like her physical therapy session, which is amazing. And that's like what we should be striving for. And, not everybody has the ability to do that, of course. That's a very special setting to have. And that's the structure that we all desire, but it's not always the case. But regardless, she was talking about how do no harm is something that is, part of the medical community, part of the field, but doesn't really necessarily apply to, or always apply to the things that we're doing with our athletes. Because if we never stress anybody, if we never put them through something that is deemed risky, then they will never continue to progress. It's like, think about a strength exercise. If I can do a 20-pound dumbbell curl and I had a bicep tear, like if I just stop at 20, but for the things I need to do, I want to do a pull-up. Like if I stop at 20 and tell you, you can do pull-ups now, and we've never done them before, and you're going to go do them on your own. Like that's actually doing a lot of harm because that's putting that person in a much more risky situation than if you slowly progress them and gave them more load and actually had them go through risky behaviors or deemed risky things with you in person. So,
I mean, that's the whole thing with like graded exposure. It's like everyone talks about graded exposure in PT and in training, right. And yet we'll do something like the discharge is a skater hop, but then there's this huge gap in between the stress of a skater hop and then getting back out of the field. Like I said, shuffling aggressively or keeping up with an opponent. So we kind of skip a lot of those steps when we don't understand that there's still there's so many different ways to grade the stress and grade the activities that we're giving our people. So that's, what we're talking about is just understanding graded exposure can be taken so far because injuries happen then once, the do no harm thing, like the discussion we were having yesterday was if PTs often see the stuff that like strength coaches do or some of the stuff that we would do with our athletes at this later stages of return to sport, it seems like it's really, really risky. But those risky situations are built upon a ton of time and a huge amount of progression from a skater hop to get into the 3 cone stack that I'm doing with this athlete right now. It's not like we went directly from a stationary stick skater hop or Haydn to a really aggressive 5-10-5 change of direction or a mirror shuffle drill or something like that. There's been a ton of different progression of stresses and forces from the Haydn to this that, yes, if you don't understand that there's many steps in between, it may look risky, but in fact, it's not risky because we've been safely progressing and getting the athlete adapted to the stresses and the forces that they're going to be encountering.
Yeah, and I would say, like, there are sometimes scenarios, like if you're up against the clock and an athlete needs to get back to a certain game, you know, for recruiting purposes or to win a championship or whatever, there's certain cases where you're probably going to have to say, I'm not really sure how this will go 100%, but outside of those situations, I don't really think there's ever a case where I don't feel comfortable with like telling an exercise, you know, you go do this exercise, we're going to come go do it together. And like, I'm not really sure how it's going to go. I don't think that ever really happens because like you said, we're doing so much before that snapshot that is leading up to that. And sometimes the athlete might not really trust themselves, but if you just put it into their terms of like, look, you did, you know, this movement last week or 2 weeks ago that, you know, is a much easier progression of this, like we can start to push it a little bit and then you can just kind of have them trust you and then they realize all of the work that they put into it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, we wouldn't, if we ever have the thought in our heads when we're choosing an exercise or a movement that this could go bad, I'm probably not going to choose it because then I probably haven't done a good enough job myself in terms of the progression of things to be able to get them to that level. You wouldn't have somebody go in day one who, you know, is coming off of a large injury. Their first time running is a max velocity sprint. That's probably going to go bad. So you do have a progressions of, you know, A skips and hops and different aerobic plyo type progressions and low impact things before you're getting somebody to sprint, because if you try to have them sprint day one, in the back of your mind, you're going to be like, yeah, this is probably not going to go well, or there's a pretty, it's almost a flip of a coin whether or not they're going to hurt themselves or not. So if that's ever the situation we're choosing, which we never are, then there's kind of an issue with that. But like you said, we wouldn't choose something without having done a logical progression prior to it. So that in and of itself minimizes the risk of what we're choosing to do in those later stages.
Right. And then what, you know, Doug and Nicole were talking about on the podcast last week that was interesting and nice to hear was like Nicole's she's a very straightforward therapist, a lot of great progressions from, you know, at least the limited access I've seen, the stuff I've seen her do. But she wrote an article about open chain exercises with post-op ACLs, and it kind of like got some hate on Twitter, which is so funny because it's like if there's, you know, everybody just has to argue about something like you're only going to do open chain exercises or you're only going to do closed chain exercises. Like, no, we're going to do everything. And it'd be a disservice not to do everything, especially, you know, they spoke a lot about self-organization, and there's a lot of people that say like, oh, like it doesn't matter what we do, like the athlete's going to self-organize, and you know, it's all like psychosocial and everything like that. And to Nicole's point, she mentioned how like, yeah, they're going to self-organize, but if they don't have the quad strength to do something then faster and more powerful, they're not going to use a self-organization strategy that's either safe or going to be effective in a game. Which I thought, again, it's like that's very interesting. And again, that's just another leap of faith. If you're just going to say I'm good not doing certain things, and then they're going to figure it out on their own anyway. Like you have to stress the body. And to me, like a seated knee extension, that's a lot of quad work. That's a lot of motor recruitment of the quad. And people are going to argue and say like, oh, well, so is squatting. It's like, yeah, we're also going to squat. And that's part of the program. We're not skipping squatting because we want to do open chain, you know, leg extensions. And we have at the new facility that you're at, there's a knee extension machine right there in the corner because we're going to do isolated hamstring and quad work with people. And like, we find that very important because there's a lot of situations where you need to isolate certain things and just recruit certain things as much as possible. Otherwise, like I said, there's going to be zero self-organization that's effective later down the road, where they're going to have to then hinge the hips to not use their knee or just use their ankle to push. And that is doing harm if you're not then preparing that person to use their knee and flex it and bend it and be strong.
When you see somebody that has especially post-op atrophy is normal and it's part of it's like typical result of surgery. If they have quad atrophy, what are you going to do to get that quad bigger? It's like you have to get the quad strength back. It's like, why are we going to not do what has worked for years and years and years and years and years and years, which is isolated muscle work? Why are we not doing that? Like, why does that not make sense?
Look at the bodybuilding community. Like,
right.
You want to talk about like
quads.
having strong quads? Like, you can isolate your quad and it's okay, and it's not going to like destroy you because it's not functional, whatever functional means, which is all like based on the context of the person in front of you anyway. But like if you don't have the quad strength, you're not going to self-organize, and then nothing you do is going to be functional, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's not that we expect only doing knee extensions to then transfer to a really good lunge stop or to a vertical jump or something like that.
We would all agree.
You're doing that stuff all the time. Yeah,
right.
You're doing that stuff throughout the entire process, just in conjunction with each other. It's like we have to take one small thing, and that's a summary of the totality of everything that you're doing, and that's just not the way it is. Just because a part of the rehab process includes open chain knee extension stuff doesn't mean that you're doing it throughout the whole time. Once the quad is strong enough, yeah, I'm probably gonna spend time doing something that's a little bit better for them. But early on, yes, open chain knee extension is great for quad improvement and getting the quad stronger. So why not do it?
So funny too, because especially for soccer, that's like the only sport where that I can think of right now, there's actually like kicking is open chain knee extension.
Right.
And that's the one that we're all arguing about not doing open chain, work with ACL. So that's just like, I don't know. I just thought that it's pretty funny.
Yeah.
And then the focus is always on ACLs, and it's such a common injury, and people can speak that language a lot. And the one example you brought up before with I have a wrestler post-op with a labrum surgery, 3 months ago, a little bit over 3 months ago. And like, he's crushing it. And if you said, if other therapists who aren't privy to strength and conditioning principles, progressions, and actually pushing athletes, they would probably see all the stuff we're doing and say, like, that's not therapy. That looks dangerous. But that's only because of the fact that I'm a physical therapist. Like, if they were with a strength coach doing that stuff, it'd be like, oh yeah, that person's a beast.
Yeah.
But it's like, yeah, no, this kid's actually a beast, and he's a college wrestler. He's physically mature and very capable, and he's doing like double arm push pressing with a landmine the other day, and I'm filming this stuff thinking about just like, if I send this to a doctor, like, they're gonna be almost like afraid, but they probably haven't understood that there's all of these things that have led up to it. We've done a ton of single leg or single arm, half kneeling, landmine pressing. Slowly, we've built up strength until they're pretty much symmetrical. It's like, now we can do things a little faster because he's also done med ball throws, like, which are a higher velocity. So then we're almost meeting the two together, where there's now a strength component and a speed component. So we're doing something like a push press. And
that's because something like that, the goal is to get him ready for his sport and meet the standards of the sport, which is a term that Rob Panarello used that I love, because it's not just about, we talked about earlier, of getting them on the court or on the mat or on the field, but it's getting them ready to compete against their peers. And if they're not strong enough, just because they don't have pain and they have, good range of motion or full range of motion and decent strength, doesn't mean that they're ready to do something really hard and do something at high velocity or high strength or high force, because you haven't progressed them for it. So if their peers have been doing that stuff, but they're not, then they're not really ready for the sport yet. Just because they could theoretically be on the court or beyond the field doesn't mean that they're actually ready to handle what's going to be going on.
Yeah, and then going it's all full circle, going back to like the do no harm thing. If you're that exact athlete that you're talking about isn't going to be able to compete with their peers, they're going to be under more fatigue sooner, which is when people are going to be most likely to get injured. So again, putting people through fatigue, building capacity, power, like, this is all stuff that we need to be doing. Otherwise, we are doing harm for our athletes. And then there was something else I had just thought about bringing up that was related to this. This always happens to me.
I'm trying to think what we talked about. Yeah, it just, to me, it's not, it becomes so go ahead.
We were talking about physical therapy school because we have these students. So, often the focus of physical therapy or the focus of like a medical field is like you're starting out with somebody who's unable to do things, and that's sort of the focus, is like pushing them from being unable to being able. And what we were talking about yesterday is that if that's the lens that you, if that's the only lens that you see things through, you never really know where you can get, as opposed to if you start with the lens of strength and conditioning being almost like that's the guide for, that should be the guide for like sports therapy, orthopedic physical therapy. The end, is the beginning, and you need to understand strength and conditioning principles. And we were strength and conditioning coaches before we were therapists, and you have to understand those things first so that you can progress somebody through, out of that rehab, quote unquote, like rehab situation, to then where you're sort of muddying the water of, is this really strength and conditioning or is this actually rehab? And there's really no difference in our mind. And again, like that just brings me back to this college wrestler I have. Like we'll do some manual therapy in the beginning just to kind of get that repetitive effect of doing it. And it might be 10-15 minutes. I don't even, yeah, probably something like that. And then besides that, like he's doing a strength and conditioning program. There's nothing that's necessarily like, he's not doing like banded external rotations, like side lying, dumbbell ER. Like if that's all he was doing, which he actually did last year before or after a different surgery, but if that's all he did and then just started wrestling, he's going to be in a world of pain and he's going to lose. He's probably going to get injured. He wouldn't be happy. And then that would be on me if I didn't prepare him properly, because he's not, exactly. It's not his fault. He needs to be guided through this process. So we need to have the understanding of strength and conditioning principles, and that should be driving any of our rehab, period, in my mind.
Because we talked about yesterday too, the difference between studying like patho things and things that are already kind of beat up and broken, and understanding where they are after a surgery or after an injury, but not spending enough time knowing what healthy, uninhibited function looks like. It was the same thing, Doug's analogy of lecturing birds about flight. It's kind of the same thing. It's like if we're only studying something that's broken, but we don't understand how it's supposed to function when it's fully healthy, then we're often letting people be discharged too soon before they're actually at that thing where they're functioning optimally or functioning more efficiently than they can be. So it's like the bar is so low sometimes once somebody's had an injury, that to feel better and to be able to do normal ADLs and everyday type things is pretty easy and pretty simple. It's getting very people easy beyond that to get back to their high level function, whether it's sport or it doesn't even have to be competitive sport like a college or professional or high school athlete. That doesn't matter, but it could just be somebody that wants to go play tennis. Like if somebody had a shoulder injury and then they're trying to go play tennis with their friends, but they haven't done anything overhead with any sort of velocity or strength, then we're probably not going to really have them be prepared to go back and play tennis, and the shoulder is going to probably bother them again. So it's just understanding that, like, what are the things involved that they ultimately need to get back to, and then how do we grade the stress from where they are to get them back to where they want to be without having these huge leaps and jumps between different exercises and different movements that we choose. Because there's so many ways that you can choose something, and there's no one best exercise for whatever we're choosing, but there's a million different reasons why we choose the things that we choose. And I think that's kind of the rationale and the reasoning that we always want our students to learn, is that it doesn't really matter what you choose. It just has to be safe and has to be effective and has to give the effect that we're looking for, or the effect that you're choosing, and why you have to have intent behind your choices. And as long as what we're choosing matches that intent and it's still safe, then you're doing a good job.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think we flushed it out pretty good.
There you go.
I don't know if there's anything else you can think of right now related to this, but I definitely recommend listening to the podcast last week. Definitely related to what we were talking about here, and a little bit more. They dive into it a little bit more, maybe. And then, it's nice to also hear it from a different therapist too. You're not just hearing it from resilient therapists only. We're seeking out other therapists like us to learn from. So it's been nice to have some guests on our podcast.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So that would wrap this Keep It Real episode up, and hopefully we hear you, have you back soon. So if you're listening to this on iTunes, recommend you head over to our YouTube channel. We're gonna we have all these podcasts recorded video, and they're all on our YouTube channel as well, because sometimes the conversations can get into like a more physical demonstration or something like that. More so in the future, we hope to do things like that. But we also now are doing a quick little tour of our new facility, 377 Park Avenue South in Manhattan. It's between 26th and 27th Street on Park Avenue. So Trevor's going to just take you around. This is all the equipment we just had installed. What was it, 2 weeks ago? A little less than that, maybe.
Just over 2 weeks ago, I believe.
Yeah, so it's like 2,000 square foot facility, right?
Yep, exactly. So this kind of front part of the space is kind of more of the gym fitness area. You can see we have the turf here with our slide board. If we kind of go over, we see our dual hamstring curl leg extension Nautilus machine. We have our RFE stand, landmine, the Legend rack with a bunch of really cool, neat attachments on it. And then towards the front, we have our plyo boxes, our Versa climber, our Schwinn Airdyne bike, the Truth Form treadmill, and then we have the power blocks and Kaiser dual pulley system.
And right now, you guys are treating
kind of
on.
The other end, turf continues, and then we have kind of more of our treatment area down at the other end of the space.
There you go. Yeah, because right now it's more of a temporary table treatment situation, right? We have tables on the way, and then there's a whole nother back room that will be more of like the treatment area with a private area too. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, so we're really excited about our new facility, and hopefully you guys can stop by soon. Let us know if you want to come by. All right, have a good day. Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on our online products, which you can find at resilientperformance.com. We'd like you to use the promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, to get the 10% off. Right now we have the Resilient Movement Foundations course online format for you to purchase there. And we hope to grow that soon before the end of the year and have some other offerings. We hope you enjoy. Again, that's promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, for 10% off. Thanks.